Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Gene Moran, a retired Navy captain and longtime advisor to U.S. defense companies, about the changing nature of the defense industry and what the Defense Department needs to do to revamp its contracting and acquisition processes. And then we break down U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, Elon Musk and the DOGE and their effort to overhaul huge portions of the federal government, and President Trump's controversial proposal for the U.S. to take over and redevelop the Gaza Strip. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A fantastic and very newsy show today for you all. Guy has a great discussion coming up with Gene Moran, retired Navy captain and a longtime advisor to U.S. defense companies. So if you're interested in a really in-depth conversation about the ins and outs of the Defense Department contracting and acquisition processes and the evolution of the defense industry as a whole, definitely stay tuned for that. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here with you for another week. Several things I'm tracking. First is the wave of U.S. airstrikes that President Trump authorized in recent days against what administration officials say were high-level Islamic State targets in Somalia, the war-torn Horn of Africa country. This was the first American military bombing of a terror group since Mr. Trump took office. You have reported for years, Ben, about U.S. policy toward Islamic extremist groups in Somalia, specifically the group Al-Shabaab. The latest strikes did not garner much media attention, but certainly caught my eye as an indication that the U.S. war against the Islamic State, or ISIS, terror group is continuing into the new Trump era. I was separately struck that executives at Google have shifted the tech giant's artificial intelligence ethics policy by dropping a section that had previously said Google was against using AI for weapons development. Google Senior Vice President James Manyika and Google DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis revealed the policy shift in a blog post a couple of days ago, indicating that the company is now interested in AI that benefits U.S. national security, while also emphasizing that Google wants democratic governments around the world to oversee AI production and advancements. The fact that Google is essentially saying outright that it now would tolerate AI use in weapons development is a reflection of the reality, Ben, that the U.S. tech sector is moving closer to the U.S. federal government's national security apparatus. That's a trend we saw in motion before the arrival of Trump. Maybe the trend is accelerating now as companies seek to cozy up to hawks in the new administration. Or it could be that the biggest U.S. tech juggernauts are actually wary that Chinese government-connected companies are outpacing the U.S. in using AI in weapons development and creating a so-called digital Silk Road AI-driven surveillance state across a network of like-minded authoritarian governments around the world. We're tracking all of that in Threat Status, Ben, especially in the NatSec Tech editions of the Threat Status daily newsletter. The NatSec Tech editions come out every Thursday. As for tech giants cozying up to the Trump administration, the most prominent example remains Elon Musk, who heads Trump's Department of Government Efficiency. DOGE's aggressive actions so far, Ben, are prompting some serious national security concerns. On one front, Musk is advocating that all U.S. foreign aid moving through the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID as it's called, be ended, period, full stop. that could have a dramatic and detrimental impact on Washington's ability to project so-called soft power around the world. I'll get more into that a little later in our Threat of the Week section. I want to highlight one thing on DOGE. Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee are warning that DOGE operatives working for Elon Musk are a bit ham-fisted and have been given too much power too fast. A group of senators wrote a letter to the White House on February 5, warning that DOGE's activities, quote, risk exposure of classified and other sensitive information, end quote. In other words, DOGE's operatives are seen to be running roughshod through files of a slew of U.S. agencies right now, and the chance of sensitive leaks is real.
Well, Guy, and I know you've heard this from sources of yours in the government, and I certainly have too, that, you have folks who are our age in their 40s or even older who have spent decades working with the federal government. And now all of a sudden you have, younger 22, 23-year-olds coming out from Silicon Valley, as you said, running roughshod through the federal government. So that's a separate dynamic here, I think, on its own. It's worth keeping in mind is just what the interpersonal relationships are like now at places like USAID or increasingly departments, agencies all across the federal government, where there's certainly an attitude I'm hearing from folks of, who are these guys again? What exactly are their qualifications? What do they know about the federal government? What do they know about USAID? What do they know about soft power projection? A lot of that's up in the air and a little bit of a question mark right now. So we'll keep an eye on that for sure. Now, Guy, we have to mention at least briefly, and it's hard to believe that this was only a week ago, but we haven't talked about this yet on the Threat Status podcast, the crash last week between an Army Black Hawk helicopter and a commercial jet near Reagan Airport in Virginia, right outside Washington. It's an airport I've flown out of dozens of times. I know you have as well. A lot of our listeners probably have too. Now, new data this week seemed to show the Black Hawk was flying too high at the time of the crash, though the NTSB said it still needs more information before reaching a final determination. This whole incident spawned a lot of conspiracy theories online, which I'm not going to dedicate any time to here in the show, but I will say this is a big test for new Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. There have been a lot of major aviation-related accidents across the U.S. military over the past few years. Today, just a couple hours before we started recording this on Thursday, there were reports of a military contracted plane going down in the Philippines, killing a U.S. service member and 3 contractors. A lot of questions, of course, about the details surrounding that incident, but it's the latest in a line of these. So this is a big test for Pete Hegseth to get a handle on these and stop them, because his boss, President Trump, isn't going to stand for anything less. And speaking of the president, Guy, we need to touch on this, I guess, wildly controversial proposal, you could say, that President Trump laid out, that the U.S. take over the devastated Gaza Strip, move out the more than 2 million Palestinians who have been living there, and redevelop the Strip into what he described as the Riviera of the Middle East. The reaction to this, as one might expect, on the American political left, across the Middle East, and especially countries like Jordan and Egypt that theoretically would have to take in Palestinian refugees, in Europe, at the UN, human rights groups, we can go on, sheer horror, disbelief. People were just appalled by this. Now, Trump did clarify a little bit just this week, saying Israel would turn over Gaza to the U.S. when its military operation against Hamas is over, that no U.S. troops would be needed on the ground to secure Gaza, and that the Palestinians living there would only be displaced temporarily and ultimately would be moved into, quote, far safer and more beautiful communities, unquote. We could spend hours, of course, dissecting all the reasons why. Plenty of observers think this is deeply problematic. It was certainly a bit strange, for me anyway, to hear Trump say that the U.S. would take over and have an ownership stake in Gaza, given that he otherwise wants to reduce the direct American footprint in that part of the world. In fact, it was so unexpected and so seemingly at odds with Trump's broader philosophy that, in my view, Guy, there's really only one interpretation of this that makes sense, and that is Trump is shifting the Overton window, or at least trying to. I think, Trump is right when he says, according to reports, that he'd become frustrated by a lack of ideas that he was hearing about what to do with Gaza. He doesn't think that anybody, not the UN, not Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Europe, certainly not U.S. liberals, have any legitimate, workable ideas what to do with Gaza. So if everybody's spinning their wheels on this again, why not propose something so outrageous that it shifts the public discourse and maybe sparks a new discussion and maybe some new ideas? Maybe this does get Saudi Arabia to say that it will recognize Israel, establish formal diplomatic ties without the creation of an actual Palestinian state. Maybe it accepts something less than that, which is to say, maybe it accepts any kind of future that doesn't involve Jared Kushner and a bunch of real estate developers running the Gaza Strip with the backing of the U.S. military. For that reason alone, I kind of love that he brought this up. Will it actually happen? I can't imagine that it will. But once again, the media coverage and hysteria around this has taken on a life of its own. The coverage of Trump and his crazy ideas, that's the story now, today, as much as Gaza itself. I don't think Trump cares, Guy. I think he wanted to start a conversation with this, and it's obvious that he has.
Gene Moran is a retired U.S. Navy captain and longtime advisor to U.S. defense companies, trying to navigate everything from contracts with the Pentagon to basic interactions with all facets of the U.S. government. He's also a PhD and the author of the 2023 book, Government Deals Are Funded, Not Sold. Gene, thank you for coming on the podcast.
You bet, Guy. Glad to be here.
A lot of people in the national security community say that the U.S. defense industrial space is in a state of immense transition right now because of technological change. Do you agree with that? And can you help me unpack it from the perspective of emerging companies that are trying to get contracted by the Pentagon?
Yeah, it's been undergoing change for a number of years. You could go back to sequestration in 2011. It was measured that the industrial base consolidated by around 20% in those few years. It happened again in COVID, another 15%. As I've done academic research on facets of the defense industrial base, there's a question about how big it really is. You hear numbers of 100,000 up to 1 million. Academics sort of land on about 350,000 companies in the defense industrial base. As recently as 2019, SecDef Esper publicly stated there were 1 million. It's been under pressure for some time. Layer onto that the emergence of just new technologies, a movement toward software-driven solutions, and the ability to update software on the fly, much like you might update your iPhone or a Tesla. That world is here, but the acquisition system needed for it isn't here.
Well, speaking of the acquisition system and also this consolidation, it feels like if we go back 20, 25 years, the whole U.S. defense industrial landscape was more or less dominated by a handful of major prime companies: Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, Boeing. But that landscape, you just mentioned 100,000 companies. There are so many new companies emerging as kind of primes. Walk me through that, and with an eye toward how can up and coming small firms that we haven't heard of break into this space. Is it possible at this moment, when the Pentagon claims to want to work with smaller companies that have access to or developing advanced tech at a faster rate than the big primes? Where are we going with that?
Yeah, let me come at that a couple of ways. Think of a pyramid of the acquisition dollars. And if you were to slice that pyramid into a few pieces, at the top half of that pyramid, there would be 40 companies who take home half of the acquisition dollars. There are 5 companies that take home 30%. Now go down to the third layer in that triangle, and that now you're into the set-asides, and that generally translates to about 70,000 opportunities per year. And then below that is the free and open competition. All the other guys that are big enough to play, but they don't qualify for a set-aside. Those are in the hundreds of thousands. So it's not well distributed by any means. When we think of the big primes, you're typically thinking of the very largest 5, but you can be a smaller company and still be a prime. So just to clarify that terminology there, we talk a good game that we want to be available to industry. We want to let small business in as an executive branch, but we have not done well at that at all. And even when we've done it with great fanfare, it's been in very small numbers. It's very difficult to break into some of these opportunities. The other transition authority, the OTA type contracting, was supposed to be a way to speed things along, and it works in some areas. It does not work so well in others. I advise companies all the time to not be constrained by the title of small business set aside. If you're in that category, if you qualify for women-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned, 8A or hub zone, it's great that you do, but don't let that define who you are. Just provide the product or service and do the best you can. Last year, I had 3 of my small companies that I work with break through into the free and open competition. They're no longer a small business. So you can break through. That valley of death is well identified. The time from a great idea or a new innovation until the time that it's programmed into the budget, that's a transit that I try to help my companies just zip line right over. I have an ebook called Zip Lining Through the Valley of Death. You don't want to make that long, tortuous journey, and there are ways around it, but you can't do it alone. You need people helping you navigate this space. It's just too complex.
Why is it so difficult for these smaller companies to break in? I mean, what is the most common blocker to that? I know our listeners in the defense industrial space will have followed this up to this point, but for the broader general audience, what is it that keeps it so that the primes get all the money or the lion's share?
Yeah, this will sound very obvious. My PhD research focused on the defense executives' understanding of how to approach Washington and Congress. It had never been looked at from the perspective of defense executives before. And it turns out that a lack of awareness about process and networks is the number one inhibitor. 100% of defense executives will acknowledge that they learned how to do what they do through on-the-job training. And that's an expensive way to learn, and it takes a long time to learn that way. And the process is complex. We're dealing with an acquisition system that's been in various states of evolution for at least 3 decades. We've had better buying power 1, 2, and 3.0. We've had a planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system that's been with us since the 60s in some form or other. We had to bring a commission together to try to figure out some good ideas to how to improve that. Those over 20 good ideas landed in Congress with a thud, and they pretty much said in writing in the bill, thanks very much. We kind of like the way it's going, and we're not going to implement this right away. That's a paraphrased version, but it's just a complicated process, and you can't learn it unless you've been in it or have somebody with you that's been in it. And it's a shame that it's so hard, but it is. It's wonderful to think that we can adopt Silicon Valley thinking in our Washington arena. It is not the same. We learned this lesson over and over. There are some companies who are successfully changing it from the inside out, but they are in the minority.
I've actually been studying it on the side as a journalist for a few hours a week for about the last 25 years. And at this point, I feel like I just generally can grope my way around the machinations of the overall acquisition space. What's interesting right now to me is, what is the Trump impact going to be? And how do you see the Elon Musk run Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, impacting or potentially dramatically changing the whole acquisition space?
I don't think you would get a single argument from anybody in any of the major systems commands that there are too many people involved in the process, and that potentially thousands of positions could be either removed or adjusted in some way to make things more efficient. Part of the problem is that we're building the airplane in flight, or changing the configuration of the airplane in flight, and you can't just stop and start a new way and get to that changed environment. They're rattling the cage very hard right now in government to shake things up and do things differently. the legality of which I think has yet to be fully flexed. Some of these buyouts that are happening in other agencies. I have said that by June, I think DOD will look very different because it will reach DOD. Just observing how the defense industry is responding to the Trump administration coming in this time. They're a little sluggish to acknowledge that, hey, there is a new team in town. It may not have been what you expected, and there's good and bad. There is room for improvement. Is this the easiest way to do it? Certainly feels good if you're the one taking executive action, but we'll see how it winds up. Unfortunately, we may lose some very experienced people in the process. Those people who are at a point in their career where they have a decision to make. Do I want to stay for the really long term? Do I want to be a very senior officer, for example, or do I want to be an SES? They might say, "Hey, it looks much more attractive out in the business world."
I'm going to ask the same question, but a little bit refined. Let's say we're talking about new tech, or for instance, something like the Pentagon's Replicator advanced drone acquisition initiative. What is your advice to the Trump administration on how to streamline the acquisition process there so that the military can field new higher tech products faster?
Yeah, too many people get to touch the requirement along the way. A requirement may be agreed and resourced, and then it gets into the technical world where a tech warrant holder can say, that's really not a good idea because in 1972 we had this happen to us, and we can't risk that happening again. Elon Musk is successful in his business because he takes much more risk. I'm not saying that the government is ready to take the kinds of risk that SpaceX or Tesla, for example, might take, but we are erring way too far in the direction of being 100% certain of something before we proceed. So we need to accept some of the risk that comes with moving faster, and just have fewer people in the approval process. Not to take us too far adrift, but I think we will find, and it may be happening as we speak, that some AI tools will be able to do a better job of reviewing documentation and conformance and compliance that can sometimes hold us up.
Let's shift toward China and the Indo-Pacific and geopolitics for a second. I did a threat status video interview with Seth Jones at the Center for Strategic and International Studies last year, in which he said outright that China is now outpacing the U.S. in terms of overall defense industrial production capability. First, do you agree with that? And then second, as we go forward now into 2025, we're facing a Chinese Navy that technically has more ships than the U.S. It has designs to become the preeminent military power in the Indo-Pacific. How does the U.S. develop a strategy that mitigates risk there and leverages technology? Is this about just building more ships? Is it about futuristic satellites and AI? What's the way forward?
Yeah, it's never been strictly a number count. And if you go by the number count, China is definitely outpacing us. They are able to make decisions and put the full force of government behind those decisions to build whatever the number of ships is. I don't study those numbers in detail, but I've seen the sort of the meta-analysis and the war gaming that has come from it. The U.S. tends to pick a point number and say we're going to drive to that number that everybody knows we can never get to, because the industrial base can't support it and the political wherewithal isn't there to address it. Just look at our most recent presidential campaign. We hardly talked about national security at all. We did not talk about shipbuilding in any way during the campaign, and these are major issues. This shipbuilding industrial base has been in decline for decades now, and we can't build our way out of this no matter how much money we throw at it without making some change. Now, I started by saying it's not about the number. and we need to stop making it about the number. It's about capacity and the integration of systems. We are finally getting our traction on uncrewed vehicles, both surface and underwater. Those will make a tremendous difference. It took the Navy a while to formulate its plan. It had a couple of false starts, but now it really is making some headway, and industry is helping. I work with a number of companies in all of those domains. I was just at the Surface Navy Association Symposium, where Naval Forces Europe was in town specifically to highlight the sort of waterfront efforts of unmanned surface vessels that are being tested, in a much more rapid way. We've learned a lot through some of these recent conflicts with Ukraine and Russia, for example. Ukraine's incredible creativity in the uncrewed world, and how to use those effectively against a formidable foe, and caught them off guard.
Guerrilla style digital drone weaponry.
Yeah. So, what's the answer here? We need to have an integrated methodology. We need to get away from the point number. There are people who have been advising Navy how to better manage how it retires its fleet, at the end of life, and that's a way that other nations tend to throttle what is the number of ships on active duty at any one time. But in the present state, we're not in a good position. Most, if not all, war games that have us in a Taiwan defense scenario describe a win by the U.S. in the end, but a very ugly win that will involve loss of life and loss of capital ship.
Gene Moran, thank you so much for sharing your insights and perspective with the Threat Status Podcast.
Good to be with you, Guy. Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security this week as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what's your threat of the week?
Ben, my threat of the week is that the Trump administration, while perhaps well-intentioned in focusing on the notoriously bogged down bureaucracy of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, that the administration may cut too far and too fast in a way that does long-term damage to sensitive U.S. foreign policy of upholding free civil society organizations and promoting democracy in fragile countries around the world. Ben, we just released an exclusive Threat Status Influencers video interview on February 6th with Daniel Twining, the head of IRI, or the International Republican Institute, which gets federal dollars to do such democracy promotion. I hope listeners here will go find the video on the Threat Status pages of the Washington Times. Dan Twining says he welcomes the administration's scrutiny of every dollar spent by the federal government, but he also stresses that cutting soft power funding in countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and so on could be disastrous in the long term because such programs promote stability and because U.S. adversaries like China and Russia will sweep in and fill the void, essentially having more of a free hand to spread anti-U.S., anti-democratic messaging in those countries and pretty much across the entire global south.
Power is the operative word. It might be soft power, but it is indeed American power nonetheless. That's worth keeping in mind when we talk about the impacts these cuts, these rollbacks could have on U.S. national security and foreign policy. Guy, this may not sound like a direct security threat, but as we all know, the economy is directly related to national security and social unrest, and that's why my threat of the week is bird flu, which is the driving force behind a major price surge in things like egg prices, and I'm sure any listener who's been at the grocery store recently can attest to this. Now, before we go into the egg aspect a little more, it's worth worth mentioning that just this week, at least 6 dairy herds in Nevada tested positive for a new variant of the H5N1 bird flu virus. That's different than another variant that had been spreading through dairy cattle across the country. So potential problems on the horizon for dairy prices as well. But the more immediate concern is the price of eggs. The price of a dozen of eggs has more than doubled since the summer of 2023. The average price nationwide reached $4.15 back in December, according to the Department of Agriculture. By January 18th, it was $5.29. Prices have gone higher since, over $7 in some parts of the country, which is about what I paid just earlier this week. In New York City, it's reportedly over $12 in some places. And the federal government expects a 20% rise in egg prices throughout the course of the year. So you'll feel this at restaurants as well. The Waffle House announced a 50% surcharge on eggs with all of its meals this week. So this is bad news for consumers, all of us, but it's also a big political problem, Guy, for President Trump and Vice President Vance, who campaigned on bringing down the cost of groceries. And now we're talking about skyrocketing prices for basic things like eggs, let alone the fact that there could be a major public health crisis on the horizon if this doesn't get addressed soon. So this is a major economic and political threat right now domestically to the United States of America, and that's why it's my threat of the week. And with that, thank you all very much. Guy, thank you as always. A huge thanks to Gene Moran for joining us, and thank you all so much for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.